You know the picture, right? The Pilgrims, those black hats, the big buckles, sharing this perfect, peaceful feast with their new Native American friends. It's a story of the first Thanksgiving. It's a really powerful image. But you know what? The real history, the story of the Plymouth colony, is so much more desperate and way more complex. And honestly, it's a lot more fascinating than the simple little tale we all learned in school. So let's get into it. Let's peel back the layers and separate the hard, gritty facts from the comforting myth.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First up, we're going to figure out who these people we call the Pilgrims actually were. Then we'll follow them on that brutal trip across the ocean and see how a political crisis basically exploded on the ship. After that, we'll face the harsh reality of their first winter. And of course, we're going to take a really close look at that famous 1621 feast. And finally, we'll connect the dots and see how this tangled, messy history got ironed out into one of America's most famous myths. So let's start at the very beginning because even the name can throw you off. They never, ever called themselves Pilgrims. Nope, that name didn't really stick for almost 200 years. So if they weren't Pilgrims, who were they?
And this right here is probably the biggest point of confusion. The folks we call Pilgrims were a radical group known as separatists. They looked at the official Church of England and said, "It's a lost cause. It's so corrupt, the only thing we can do is leave. Separate completely." Now the Puritans, they're a different story. They showed up about a decade later and there were way more of them. They were non-separating, they wanted to stay in the church, but as their name suggests, purify it from the inside. This one difference, separate versus purify, is the key to their entire story. Now, having these radical beliefs in England at the time, that was a dangerous game. Their future governor, a guy named William Bradford, he wrote that they were literally hunted and persecuted on every side. People spied on their homes, they got thrown in jail, they had to give up their livelihoods. So their first escape wasn't to America, it was to Holland, which was famous for being a place of religious freedom. But, after about 12 years, Holland wasn't really the paradise they'd hoped for. Bradford lays out these weighty and solid reasons why. For one, life was just plain hard. Backbreaking labor, tough living. But they were also really worried culturally. They saw their kids starting to act more Dutch than English, losing their language, their identity. They were also a bit scandalized by what they saw as the temptations of city life corrupting their children. And beyond all that, they had this burning ambition, this inward zeal, to start a society from scratch, their way, and spread their version of the gospel in a whole new world. And that ambition is what put them on the Mayflower, heading across the Atlantic. I mean, the voyage itself was awful, but the real crisis, the moment that changed absolutely everything, happened the second they saw land. So the plan was to land near the Hudson River, which was part of the Virginia colony. That's where their legal patent, basically their permission slip from the king, was good for. But the Atlantic had other plans. Vicious storms just hammered the ship and blew them way off course, hundreds of miles north to Cape Cod. Now, this was more than just a GPS error. This was a political disaster, because legally, their charter was now totally useless. They were in a place with no laws and no government. You have to remember, only about half the people on the Mayflower were actually from this separatist group. The other half, who the separatists called the strangers, were just regular folks, merchants, craftsmen, hired hands. And as soon as some of these strangers heard the rules no longer applied, they started making what Bradford called discontented and mutinous speeches. Their logic was simple. If the patent's no good, then you're not the boss of me. And just like that, the entire venture was on the verge of total anarchy. So before a single person stepped on shore, the leaders knew they had to do something drastic. They had to invent a government, right there on the spot. And the result was the Mayflower Compact. Now, just stop and think about how radical this was. This is an age of kings and queens who supposedly rule by the will of God, and here's the small group of refugees saying, no, we are going to covenant and combine ourselves together. We will create our own government, and it will be based on our consent. This was a profoundly American idea, born out of pure chaos on the deck of a ship. Okay, so they had a government. But now came the real test. As William Bradford looked out at the New England coast, all he saw was a hideous and desolate wilderness. Simply surviving their first winter here would come at a price that is almost impossible for us to imagine. The death toll that winter, it's just staggering. What they called a general sickness, which was likely a deadly mix of scurvy, pneumonia, and tuberculosis, just tore through the tiny community. In just a few months, 50% of the 102 people who arrived on the Mayflower were dead. At its peak, they were burying 2 or 3 of their friends every single day.
And if you look closer, the numbers are even more horrifying. The women of the colony were hit the hardest. Of the 18 adult women who made that long journey, only 4 were still alive after the first year. Just 4. 4 women left to care for all the sick, to cook, to clean, for the entire colony of survivors. It's just devastating. That desperation also pushed them to do things that would echo for years to come. Before they even settled on Plymouth, while they were still scouting the coast, starving and freezing, they found and stole corn from a Native American storage pit. They also dug into grave sites, taking what one of them called sundry of the prettiest things from the grave of a child. You can imagine that these first impressions were not easily forgotten by the local people. And all of that, the sickness, the death, the desperation, it all leads us to that famous harvest feast in 1621. The event that became our first Thanksgiving. But the reality of what actually went down was a lot more tense and political than the simple story of friendship we usually hear.
See, from the English point of view, sure, it was a 3-day celebration for bringing in a good harvest, but Wampanoag oral history tells a very different story. Their leader, a great sachem named Massasoit, showed up with 90 of his warriors, not because he got a dinner invitation, but because he heard the colonists firing their guns and probably thought, what is going on? Are we being attacked? This wasn't a friendly potluck. This was a tense diplomatic summit with 2 very different groups warily checking each other out.
So, if we've misunderstood the reason for the gathering, what about the food? What were they actually eating at this famous feast? Okay, so you can just forget your modern Thanksgiving plate. They didn't have sugar for cranberry sauce. They didn't have ovens for pumpkin pie. Potatoes hadn't even made it to North America yet. The reality? The Wampanoag warriors actually brought 5 deer they had hunted, so venison was the absolute star of the show. They also ate wildfowl, so ducks, geese, maybe a wild turkey, and native foods like nasump, which is a kind of thick corn porridge, and pumpion, which was basically stewed or mashed pumpkin.
Which brings us to the big question, right? How did a tense 3-day political meeting with a bunch of venison on the menu, how did that become one of America's most beloved founding stories? This is all about how real, messy history gets polished and simplified into a powerful myth.
That fragile alliance from 1621, it didn't last. Not even close. Just 16 years later, colonial soldiers massacred an entire Pequot village, and the governor of the neighboring colony declared an official Day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the slaughter. By 1675, Massasoit's own son was leading a bloody, all-out war against the colonists' endless expansion. The peaceful, sanitized story of the feast that was brought back to life and romanticized much, much later in the 1800s, when America was looking for a nice, simple origin story to unite the country. And because of that brutal history that came after the feast, the holiday means something very different to many Native Americans. This quote from Judy Dow, an Abenaki scholar, really captures that feeling. It frames the modern holiday not as a celebration of unity, but as this painful, bitter reminder of a long, long history of broken promises. And that really leaves us with one final big question. Knowing the complex, uncomfortable, and often tragic reality behind the myth, how should we remember this story today? Because it's not a story of simple heroes and villains. It's a story of incredible desperation, of almost unbelievable survival, and of a collision between 2 worlds that had consequences that are still echoing right now to this very day.